The winter Pearl Langston arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas. The temperature had dropped so sharply that even the tumbleweeds seemed to freeze mid-roll across the barren Main Street, and she stood outside the land office with exactly $4.32 in her worn leather coin purse, knowing that the rent for the smallest room above Mrs. Caldwell's dry goods store was $5 even, and that she was 32 cents, and every shred of dignity short of a new beginning. It was November of 1879, and the town of Dusty Creek sat in the high plains of West Texas like a copper penny dropped in the middle of nowhere, ringed by mesquite scrub and red clay hills that turned the color of dried blood in the late afternoon light. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it a surge of settlers, a post office, a proper saloon, and the peculiar kind of optimism that lives only in places that haven't yet been fully disappointed. Pearl had ridden the last leg from San Antonio on a mail wagon, seated between a crate of live chickens and a barrel of salt pork, because it was the only transportation she could afford after her father's passing had left her with nothing but his old Bible and a wagon that fell apart 2 days outside of Laredo. She was 22 years old with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned tightly beneath a faded blue bonnet, and eyes the color of Winter Creek water, that particular pale gray-green that shifts depending on the light. She was not a fragile woman. Her hands were already calloused from years of helping her father on his failing farm south of San Antonio, and her jaw had the set of someone who had learned early that softness was a luxury like sugar and new shoes, something you rationed carefully. But standing on that frozen street, with the wind cutting straight through her thin wool coat and the coin purse feeling impossibly light in her palm, she felt fragile in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She had already spoken to Mrs. Caldwell, a wide-hipped widow with spectacles pushed up on her forehead and a disposition like dried leather, tough but not without give. The room was small, the woman had told her, barely large enough for a cot and a washstand, but it had a window that faced east and got the morning sun, and the rent was $5 on the first of the month. No exceptions, no credit, and no gentlemen callers past 7 o'clock in the evening. Pearl had nodded at all of it, counted her money twice in the privacy of her own pocket, and told Mrs. Caldwell she would return before sundown to settle the matter. She had not told Mrs. Caldwell about the 32 cents. Now she stood on the boardwalk outside the land office and tried to think her way through the problem the way her father had taught her to think through hard frosts and dry wells, calmly, without panic, one option at a time. She could ask for an advance on whatever work she might find in town, though she had not yet found any work and therefore had no employer to approach. She could ask Mrs. Caldwell for even one night's grace, though the woman's face had not suggested she was open to negotiation. She could walk back to the mail depot and ask if there was any work there, though she'd already inquired that morning and been told there was not. She was still thinking when she heard the jingle of spurs on the boardwalk behind her. He almost walked past her entirely. Joel Sawyer was 26 years old and had been working cattle on the Brennan spread outside Dusty Creek for 3 years, which meant he had the particular look of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors and at close quarters with animals that could kill him, lean and weathered and alert in the way that men who work the open range tend to be alert, always reading the horizon without appearing to do so. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under door frames, with dark brown hair grown just past his collar and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. He wore a heavy canvas winter coat, the good kind with wool lining that a working cowboy saved up most of a season to afford, and he had his month's wages folded in his shirt pocket after a trip to settle his account at the feed store. He almost walked past her. What stopped him was not her beauty, though she was striking in the way that women with strong bone structure and an air of quiet determination tend to be striking. What stopped him was the way she was looking at her own hand. She had opened the coin purse and was counting the coins in her palm with an expression so carefully neutral that it told him everything about how she actually felt, the way a poker player's blank face tells you more than a frown would. He had worn that same expression himself at 20 years old, standing outside a livery stable in Abilene with not enough money to stable his horse for the night and too proud to show it. He stopped walking. He stood there for a moment on the boardwalk, which was not a thing he had planned to do, and looked at her with the particular combination of social calculation and conscience that afflicts decent people in awkward moments. She had not noticed him yet. She was still looking at the coins, and the wind came down the street and lifted the edge of her bonnet, and she pressed it back with one hand with the automatic gesture of someone accustomed to managing small annoyances without complaint. He cleared his throat. "Afternoon, ma'am." She looked up, and the expression on her face shifted from that careful blankness to something politely guarded, the look of a woman who has learned to be cautious about the intentions of men who speak to her in unfamiliar streets. "Good afternoon," she said. "New in town?" He asked it easily without prying weight behind it, the way people asked in small western towns where a new face was simply a fact to be noted. "As of this morning," she said. She had already closed her fist around the coins. He nodded at the land office behind her. "You looking to file a claim, or is it the Caldwell room you're after?" She looked at him a little more carefully now. "The room," she said, with the slight wariness of someone wondering how he knew. "Mrs. Caldwell's the only one who rents in town," he explained. "And the land office doesn't have anything worth filing on within 20 miles of here right now." He paused. "I'm Joel Sawyer. I work the Brennan Ranch about 4 miles east." "Pearl Langston," she said, and she did not offer her hand because women in 1879 West Texas did not generally shake hands with strange men on boardwalks, but she held his gaze in a way that was direct without being forward. "I came up from San Antonio. Long trip. Long enough." There was a brief pause in which both of them stood in the cold wind, and neither of them said what was actually occupying the air between them, which was the obvious fact of the coins in her fist, and the obvious fact that he had seen them, and the obvious fact that she knew he had. Joel Sawyer had not set out that morning to involve himself in the affairs of a woman he did not know. He had set out to pay his bill at the feed store and maybe buy himself a hot meal at the boarding house kitchen and ride back to the ranch before full dark. He was not, by nature, a man who threw himself into other people's troubles. He was quiet, considered, the kind of man who watched more than he spoke and acted only when he had thought a thing through. But he had also been a young man alone and short of money in a strange town, and he remembered what it felt like. And he had the unfortunate quality of empathy that makes some people constitutionally unable to walk away from a thing once they've properly seen it. He unfolded his wages from his shirt pocket and looked at them for a moment, which was a gesture that probably appeared more casual than it felt, because those wages were $7.50, and they represented 4 weeks of hard work in cold weather, and he had his own plans for them, new boots being the primary plan, since the ones he was wearing had a sole that was separating at the toe, and he'd been stuffing them with paper since October. "What's the room running?" he asked. She looked at him with an expression that was precisely balanced between pride and something more complicated. Not quite desperation, but its near neighbor. "I've dollars," she said, and he could tell she was choosing her words with care, "which I am a small amount short of at present." "How small?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding something. 32 cents, she finally said, as though the precision of the number might restore some of the dignity that the admission itself had cost her. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is thinking and doesn't want his face to give anything away in the meantime. Then he took off his coat. It happened simply, without ceremony. He shrugged the heavy canvas coat off his shoulders and held it out to her, and she looked at it, and then at him as though she hadn't quite understood what was happening. "That coat is worth considerably more than 32 cents, he said. "Mrs. Hartley at the dry goods store buys and resells second-hand goods. She'll give you at least $1.50 for that coat, maybe $2. It's good canvas and the lining's still whole." He kept his voice matter-of-fact, the way you'd explain the workings of a water pump, because he had correctly intuited that making this into an act of generosity would make it harder for her to accept. "That'll cover your 32 cents with something left over for food." Pearl Langston stared at the coat in his outstretched hands and then at Joel Sawyer's face, and she said, "You'll freeze." "I've got a good flannel shirt," he said, "and the bunkhouse has a stove. It's November. I've been cold before." She looked at the coat for another moment, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly and thoroughly, the way people control things that cost them too much to show. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you know what your situation is, and I know what a winter coat's worth to Mrs. Hartley." He pushed the coat slightly forward just a few inches, and the gesture was deliberate, because it gave her something to take rather than asking her to reach for it, which was a distinction that mattered in terms of how it would feel afterward. "Consider it a loan if that sits better with you." She took the coat. She took it with both hands and held it and looked at him. And what was in her eyes at that moment was something she would spend years afterward trying to name accurately. Because it was not just gratitude. It was too complicated for gratitude. It was the feeling of being seen by a stranger at the exact moment when you most needed someone to see you, and the terrifying tenderness of that. "I will pay you back," she said, and she meant it the way people mean things when they intend them as a vow rather than a social nicety. "No need," he said. "There is need," she said firmly, and something in her tone made him look at her more carefully, and what he saw when he did made him feel, briefly and unexpectedly, as though the cold wind had changed direction. He tipped his hat to her, which was the appropriate gesture, and walked back up the boardwalk in his flannel shirt with his hands in his trouser pockets and the cold November air doing its level best on his unprotected arms and shoulders. And he did not look back, because looking back would have made the whole thing into something it wasn't supposed to be yet. Pearl sold the coat to Mrs. Hartley for $1.75, which brought her total to $6.07, enough for the first month's rent with a little remaining for bread and dried beans. She paid Mrs. Caldwell before sundown as she had promised, and moved her single carpetbag into the small east-facing room, and sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the gathering dark, and tried to remember everything she could about the face of the man who had handed her his coat as though it were the most unremarkable thing in the world. She stayed in Dusty Creek. She found work within the first week, hired on as a seamstress and mending woman for Mrs. Caldwell's dry goods store, which turned out to be the right kind of work for her because she was skilled at it, and because it positioned her at the center of the town's daily commerce, which meant she learned quickly who was who and what the rhythms of the place were. She made dresses for ranch wives who came into town on Saturdays, mended shirts and trouser knees for working men who brought their things in paper parcels tied with string. And slowly, over the first month and then the second, she began to feel the particular tentative security of someone who has solved the immediate problem and can now begin to look slightly further ahead. She did not see Joel Sawyer for 3 weeks after that first afternoon. She thought about him more than she intended to. Not in a way that felt romantic exactly, or at least not in a way she allowed herself to identify as romantic, because she had too many other things demanding her attention, and because she was not, by disposition, a woman who built castles in the air. But she thought about the quality of his voice, which was low and unhurried, and the way he had held the coat out to her at that slight forward angle that made it easy to take, and the fact that when she had said she would pay him back, he had looked at her with what she thought might have been respect, or the beginning of it. He came into the dry goods store on the 18th of December, 3 days before the winter solstice, when the temperature outside had dropped into the single digits, and the windows of the store were thick with frost at the edges. He was looking for a new canvas coat, which told her everything she needed to know about why he had been cold for the past 3 weeks. He was wearing a heavy wool blanket coat that looked like it might have been borrowed from someone of a slightly different shape, and his expression when he came through the door was the expression of a man who is cold and does not particularly want to discuss being cold. He saw her behind the counter and stopped just the way he had stopped on the boardwalk in November, that same quality of pause, as though he were adjusting some internal calculation. "Miss Langston," he said. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. "You found work." "I did." He looked around the store, taking in the bolts of fabric and the jars of penny candy and the display of winter goods behind the counter, and then he looked back at her with what might have been satisfaction or relief or some blend of the two. "Good," he said simply. Mrs. Caldwell had a canvas coat in his approximate size, second-hand but in decent repair, and it cost $3, which Pearl knew was the proper price, and which she carefully did not discount, because she understood instinctively that discounting it would change the nature of what had happened between them in a way that wouldn't serve either of them well. He paid for the coat without comment, shrugged it on, and declared it a good fit. He was almost at the door when he turned back, not because he had forgotten anything in the store, but because he apparently felt that the transaction needed something more to make it complete. "There's a church social on Christmas Eve," he said. "If you're new enough that you don't yet know people, it's a decent place to meet folks." "I'll consider it," she said, and she meant she would probably go because she was in fact new enough that she did not yet know enough people, but she didn't say that part. "Good," he said again, and this time when he left he looked briefly over his shoulder before the door closed, and she was looking at him when he did it. And for a moment the frost on the window and the smell of dried goods and the sound of the wind outside all felt very vivid and present, the way things feel when your attention is fully alive. She went to the church social on Christmas Eve. It was held in the small white clapboard church at the north end of Main Street, and the whole congregation of Dusty Creek was there in various states of holiday dress. The ranch families who had driven in that afternoon in wagons loaded with children, the town's merchants and their wives, the schoolteacher and the doctor and the blacksmith, and at least 4 cowboys from the Brennan spread who were making the most of a rare holiday night in town. There was a wood stove roaring in the corner and candles on every windowsill, and someone had brought a fiddle, and the whole thing had the quality of warmth that gathers in small, cold places when people press together against the winter. Joel Sawyer was standing near the stove with 2 other cowboys when Pearl came in, and he was the first person she recognized in the room. He saw her come in and excused himself from the conversation with the ease of a man who is doing something he has been thinking about doing for some time. "Miss Langston," he said, and there was something different in his voice from the dry goods store, something slightly warmer at the edges. "You came. You recommended it," she said. "I recommend a lot of things," he said, and the faint upward curve at the corner of his mouth was, she decided, a smile, the contained and economical kind. "Doesn't mean people always listen." He introduced her to people, which was a thing she would remember later as particularly thoughtful. The fact that he moved her through the room with the ease of someone who belonged there, and made sure that by the end of the evening she also belonged there, or at least had been given the social introduction that would allow belonging to develop. He introduced her to Sarah Brennan, the ranch owner's wife, who was a broad-shouldered, practical woman with a keen eye for people and a laugh that carried across any room she was in. He introduced her to the schoolteacher, Margaret Poole, who was 24 and had come out from Ohio 2 years prior, and understood something about being new and finding footing. He introduced her to the doctor, a thin, nervous man named Aldridge who always seemed to be thinking about something else, and to the blacksmith, old Clyde Horn, who shook her hand with a grip like a tractor and told her she was brave for coming to Texas alone. They ate Christmas cake and drank cider, and the fiddle player started in on some dance tunes, and the children ran between the adult legs, and the candles made everything amber and soft, and Pearl Langston stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time since her father died, that she might actually make a life here. Joel stood beside her through most of the evening. They talked, which was to say they did the careful, exploratory kind of talking that people do when they are genuinely curious about each other, and aware that being too curious too quickly is impolite. She told him about her father's farm, which had struggled against drought and low prices for 5 years before a bad heart took him in October, leaving her with nothing liquid and a deed that was worth less than the debt against it. She told him she had signed the deed back to the bank and put everything she could carry in a carpet bag and gotten on the mail wagon. She said all of this without self-pity, in the same matter-of-fact way that he had offered the coat, and he listened to it in the same way she had accepted it, with full attention and without performance. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys in a family that farmed 120 acres of unreliable ground, and about going west at 18 because the farm couldn't sustain 4 sons and he was the youngest, and it made the most sense, and about working cattle for 8 years in Kansas and then Texas, and about how he had come to Dusty Creek specifically because the Brennan spread was well managed and paid fair wages, and the foreman was a man whose word was worth something. He said all of this simply, without embellishment, and she listened with the focused quality of attention she brought to everything. "Do you mean to stay here?" she asked, at a point in the evening when the dancing had started and the noise level had risen enough to make the conversation feel more private. He looked at her sideways, which was a look that carried more consideration in it than it appeared to. "I've been thinking about land," he said. "The Brennan spread takes on good hands, but it's not mine. There's a homestead claim available about 8 miles northeast of here, near the creek fork. I've been saving toward it." "That's not a small thing to do alone," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." There was a pause, and the fiddle played, and 2 of the ranch wives danced together with their skirts swinging, and neither of them said what was sitting quietly in the space between the words, which was that neither of them was doing this alone by absolute necessity or desire, only by present circumstance. He walked her back to the Caldwell building at the end of the evening, because it was nearly 10 o'clock and it was dark and cold, and when they reached her door, he took his hat off in that way that men did when they were being properly formal, and said good night. And she said good night, and the door between them closed, and she stood in the dark hallway on the other side of it and listened to his boots on the boardwalk retreating into the cold night. And she pressed one hand flat against the door for a moment before she went up the stairs. January in Dusty Creek was brutal in the way that January on the high Texas plains tends to be brutal, which is comprehensively and without apology. The wind came off the Llano Estacado with nothing between it and the town for 100 miles, and the temperature stayed below freezing for most of the month, and the townspeople went about their business with the heads-down purposefulness of people who have made their peace with the cost of living where they have chosen to live. Joel came into the dry goods store twice a week through January, sometimes with a genuine errand, sometimes without one that Pearl could identify. He would stand at the counter and they would talk while she measured and cut fabric or sorted buttons into their bins, and the conversations ranged across a territory considerably wider than commerce. They talked about the weather, which was the common currency of any conversation in that climate, but they also talked about books, because Pearl had her father's Bible and had reread it so many times that she had moved on to borrowing from Dr. Aldridge's small library, and Joel turned out to have opinions about Dickens that were more developed than she would have expected from a man who spent most of his time on horseback. They talked about the town and its people, and about the politics of Reconstruction and Western expansion, which were the great swirling forces shaping the world they were living in, the displacement of the Comanche from the Texas plains having happened just 4 years prior, leaving a land that was newly available to settlers, but haunted in ways that Pearl felt every time she looked out at the empty red distance beyond the town's edge. She raised that last thing one afternoon in late January, not as a political lecture, but as a genuine expression of unease, the way you tell someone something you've been thinking about and don't quite know how to resolve. This was their land, she said, looking out the frost-clouded store window at the flat expanse beyond town. Comanche before for generations, and now here we all are. Joel was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was taking it seriously rather than dismissing it. Yes, he said. That's true, and I don't know what to do with that exactly. I can't unknow that I'm here, but I can try to be here in a way that doesn't do more harm. Is that enough? She asked. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't think it is, but I don't know what more is. She appreciated the honesty of not knowing more than she would have appreciated a confident answer, because she did not have a confident answer either, and the world they were living in did not offer one easily. In February, he asked her to take a Sunday walk with him, which was the appropriate way of beginning something that both of them had been aware was beginning for some weeks already. They walked east along the creek where the cottonwoods grew, their bare winter branches making a lace of shadows on the frozen ground. And the cold was sharp, but the sunlight was present, that particular clear winter light of the high plains that makes everything look three-dimensional and vivid. They walked for 2 miles in a companionable way that had some conversation in it, and also some comfortable silence, which is the mark of something real taking shape between two people, because you can only be comfortably silent with someone you trust. He reached out and took her hand where the path narrowed near a limestone outcropping, ostensibly to help her over the rough ground, and she let him take it. And after the rough ground was behind them, he did not let go, and she did not remove her hand, and they walked back to town that way, hand in the cold February air, and neither of them made a remark about it because neither of them needed to. He began calling on her properly after that, coming to the Caldwell building on Sunday afternoons with his hat in his hand, and a formal courtesy that coexisted with the easy familiarity of two people who had already said true things to each other. Mrs. Caldwell observed these visits from behind her counter with a calculating pragmatism that Pearl had come to understand was the woman's version of approval, because she had informed Pearl when the visits began that Mr. Sawyer was a solid man, not a drinker, not a gambler, owned a good horse, and his credit at the store was reliable, as though she were reading off the important columns of a ledger. Spring came to Dusty Creek in fits and starts, the way it always does in that part of Texas, warm days that make you believe winter is behind you, followed by sharp cold snaps that remind you it is not, mesquite blooming prematurely, and then having to withstand a late frost with a stoic perseverance that Pearl found increasingly easy to relate to. She had by now established herself sufficiently that she had regular clients, a small but reliable income, and something that was beginning to feel like a community, people who greeted her by name, who saved her particular pieces of fabric they thought she might want, who told her things about their lives in the gradual way that people share themselves once they've decided someone is worth the telling. Joel worked the spring roundup through April and most of May, which meant she saw him less, and the less she saw him, the clearer it became to her how much the seeing had come to matter. She found herself thinking about him in the spaces between tasks, the particular way his hands moved when he was thinking carefully about something, the way he listened to her with his whole attention, the fact that he had given her his coat without making her feel reduced by the giving. That last thing was the one she came back to most often. She had known men who were generous in ways that cost the receiver something, generosity that carries inside it an expectation of gratitude or debt or deference. What Joel had done that first afternoon was different. He had handed her a practical solution, and then stepped back and allowed her to be the person who solved her own problem with the tools he'd provided. And there was a profound respect in that which she found more moving than any elaborate declaration could have been. He came back from the roundup the last week of May, trail dusty and tired, and visibly glad to see her in a way that he managed to express without saying anything that couldn't be said in front of Mrs. Caldwell. He asked her to come with him to look at the homestead claim he'd been considering, and she said yes, And they rode out on a clear Saturday morning in June with borrowed horses and a packed dinner, 8 miles northeast along the road that skirted the creek. The land was beautiful in the particular spare way that the Texas high plains are beautiful, which requires a different kind of looking than the lush green landscapes of the East. You have to adjust your scale, learn to see the fine details within the vastness, the way the light moves across the grass, the tracks of animals in the soft creek mud, the limestone bluffs that break the otherwise horizontal world with their vertical drama. There were cottonwoods along the creek fork, a natural shelter that would serve for building, and the grass in the low ground near the water was deep and green, good grazing, and the soil in the raised area back from the flood plain had the dark look of ground that would produce. Pearl stood on the slight elevation where a house might go and looked out at the view in all four directions and felt something happen in her chest that she later described to herself as recognition, the feeling that a place is yours before you have any legitimate claim on it. "What do you think?" Joel asked, standing beside her. "I think it's remarkable land," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking not at the land but at her, and then he said, "Pearl." And the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it. It had a weight and intention that the name itself had never quite had before. And she turned to look at him, and his expression was very serious and very open, the two things together making a combination that she found almost overwhelming in its honesty. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the fact that I was planning to do this alone, the homestead, I mean, the whole of it. And then you came into the situation," and here his mouth curved slightly, "and now I find that when I think about what this land could be, I think about it with you in the picture, and I don't think that's going to stop." She looked at him for a long moment in the June light, and the creek made its small sound below them and a meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass, and she thought about the coin purse and the coat and the church social and the Sunday walks and all the conversations that had built themselves, piece by piece, into something that was now entirely load-bearing. "I think," she said carefully, "that the picture you have in your mind is the same one I have in mine." He took her hand, which he had done before, but this time it was different. This time it was the specific and intentional gesture of someone making a decision rather than a habit formed by happy accident, and he said, "Will you marry me, Pearl Langston? Will you do this with me?" She said yes. She said it simply and without hesitation, the way she said most things that mattered to her, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, and then opened them and looked at her with something so unguarded that she felt the privacy of it, as though she had been admitted to a room that was not visible from the outside. They were married in August of 1880 in the white clapboard church at the north end of Main Street, on a hot day with a sky the color of hammered tin, and a congregation that filled every pew and spilled out the door. Sarah Brennan stood up with Pearl, and the ranch foreman stood up with Joel, and Margaret Poole played the small church organ with more enthusiasm than technical precision, and made it beautiful anyway. Mrs. Caldwell was in the front pew in a dress she had pressed specifically for the occasion, and Dr. Aldridge was there, and old Clyde Horn was there, and what felt like the entire population of Dusty Creek was there, because Joel Sawyer had been in their community for 3 years, and Pearl Langston had become part of it in the space of 9 months with the particular thoroughness of a person who, when they choose a place, chooses it completely. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself from ivory cotton with a small embroidered border at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a cluster of late summer wildflowers that Margaret Poole had helped her gather from the creek bank that morning. And when she walked up the aisle of the small church toward Joel, who was standing at the front with his good suit on, and his hair combed, and an expression on his face like a man who cannot quite believe his own luck, she thought of that first afternoon in November. The coin purse and the boardwalk and the coat handed over with such deliberate, gentle practicality, and she thought that she would tell him one day exactly how that had felt, what it had meant to be seen that way at that particular moment, but she would not have to tell him that day, Today she would just marry him. They filed the homestead claim in September and began building in October, which was ambitious given the season. But Joel had arranged for help from 3 other Brennan hands during their off weeks, and the ranch foreman brought his own considerable carpentry experience to the project. And what they built in those first 2 months was a solid 2-room house of limestone and cedar, low to the ground against the wind, with the windows oriented east and south for the light. Because Pearl had told him about the east window in her Caldwell room and what it had meant to wake to the morning sun in that first hard winter, and he had listened and built accordingly. They moved in before the cold set in, with a cast-iron stove that Joel had ordered from a catalog and paid for in installments, and 2 chairs he'd made himself from cedar planks, not beautiful yet but sound, the kind of furniture that acquires beauty from use. Pearl hung her father's Bible on a peg near the door and put a braided rag rug she had made that fall on the plank floor, and they stood together in the middle of their first home on a November evening with the wind outside and the stove burning and the lamplight making gold of everything, and it felt to Pearl like arriving somewhere she had always been heading without knowing the name of the destination. The first winter on the land was hard in the way that first winters on new homesteads are hard, which is instructively, not destructively. It teaches you the specific vocabulary of the place, its cold corners and its drafts, where the snow comes in and where the ice forms, and which of the animals needs extra care when the temperature drops fast. They learned it together, which was both easier and better than learning it alone would have been, because the difficulty of it became a shared language rather than a private burden. Pearl discovered that she was expecting in March of 1881, which she had suspected since January, but had kept to herself in the particular private way that women hold such knowledge in the first weeks, as though saying it aloud might startle it away. She told Joel on a Sunday evening when the early spring light was coming through the south window, and the land outside was just beginning to show the first pale green of new growth at the creek, and she watched his face as she told him, saw the information move through him, saw him go from still to something more complicated, something that had joy in it, and also the specific gravity of understanding what it meant. And then he crossed the room to her and put his arms around her and held her for a long moment without speaking, and she felt his heart rate against her cheek, and it was faster than usual. "Are you all right?" he asked when he spoke. "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." Their son was born in November of 1881, on a cold, clear day that arrived with a hard frost and departed with a sunset the color of a new copper penny. Dr. Aldridge came out from town, and Sarah Brennan came to help, and the labor was long but uncomplicated in the way that long things can be uncomplicated, tiring but proceeding as it should. Pearl Sawyer, née Langston, was 24 years old and met her son with the same quality of directness that she brought to everything, fully present, fully committed to the reality of what was in front of her. Joel was in the outer room during the birth, which was the custom, and Pearl could hear him moving, the particular restless and controlled movement of a man who is managing fear by staying in motion. When Dr. Aldridge opened the door and told him he had a son, she heard him stop moving entirely, and then the sound of his footsteps, and then he was in the doorway looking at her with the baby in her arms, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Something that she recognized because she was feeling it herself, a kind of fundamental expansion, as though the world had just become larger than it previously was. They named him Thomas, after her father, and within the first month of his life, Joel had modified the house to add a second room in anticipation of the future siblings they intended, because they had talked about this, more than 2 children, a family large enough to fill the land they were building, because they were both people who had grown up with more space than people and felt the lack of it. The homestead grew. Joel filed for additional acreage in 1882 and had it proven up by 1884, and by then they had built the proper barn and a smokehouse and a root cellar, and the cattle herd that had started with 4 animals Joel purchased from the Brennan spread had grown to 40. And the garden that Pearl put in every spring in the deep soil near the creek was the kind of garden that becomes a source of genuine pride, productive and varied and well-tended. She still sewed, though no longer for Mrs. Caldwell's store. She sewed for the territory around them, women who came out to the Sawyer place specifically for her work, and the money from that went into a tin box on the kitchen shelf toward whatever the next necessity was. Thomas grew into a boy with his father's quietness and his mother's directness, a combination that produced someone who watched carefully and then acted with a decisiveness that occasionally startled people who had underestimated him. A daughter came in 1883, who they named Clara after Joel's mother, and then another boy in 1886, named William, who arrived with red hair that baffled both parents and delighted everyone else, and who had from his first weeks an extroversion that suggested a personality entirely his own invention. Those were good years, genuinely good, the kind that build the foundation of a life rather than simply occupying it. There were hard things too, a drought in 1883 that cost them 24 cattle and put them behind on the land improvements they'd planned, a fever in the winter of 1885 that took Thomas for a terrifying week before it broke and left him thin but intact, a dispute with a neighbor to the north over a fence line that required 3 months of careful navigation before it was resolved. But none of these things broke them, and each of them was navigated with the particular combination of resources that Pearl and Joel had built between them, practicality and humor, and the fundamental trust that comes from being genuinely known by another person. Pearl turned 30 in 1887, and Joel turned 31 that same fall, and they celebrated both birthdays on the same evening in September when the weather was mild, and the evening star was bright over the mesa to the west, with a supper table set outside under the cottonwoods, and the children eating with the focused enthusiasm of children who understand that there is cake coming. Sarah Brennan came with her husband, and Margaret Poole came, now married to a freighter named Hobbs and raising her own 2 children. And old Clyde Horn came, although he was slower than he used to be and complained of his knees. And Mrs. Caldwell came, remarkable given that she had been showing her age increasingly over the previous 2 years and rarely left her building. But she came for Pearl specifically, and sat in the best chair and ate cake with an expression that Pearl recognized as what happiness looked like on that particular face. It was the kind of evening that you know, while it is happening, that you will remember. The kind where the light is exactly right, and the people you love are where you can see them, and the world has the quality of completion, not ending, but completeness, the way a good sentence feels when all its parts are in their right places. Pearl was standing apart from the party for a moment, near the cottonwoods, watching the table and the lamplight and her children running in the grass and Joel in conversation with Mr. Brennan, when she thought about the coat again. She thought about it sometimes, the specific memory of it, the way it had felt in her hands when he held it out, the weight of it, the wool smell of it, the fact that he had not made a production of it. She had never, in the 7 years since that November afternoon, told him exactly what she had known or understood about what he had given up to give it to her. She knew because she had been in the dry goods business long enough to understand the economics of a working cowboy's wages, what a good winter coat cost relative to a month's pay, and she knew that selling it to Mrs. Hartley for $1.75 had given her more than she'd needed for the rent, which meant the coat had been worth more than $1.75, which meant he had lost something real in giving it away. She had known this in a general way for years. But it was only recently, talking to an old Brennan hand named Curtis who had worked alongside Joel in those early years, that she had learned the specific detail that made it concrete. Curtis had mentioned, in the way that old stories surface casually in conversation without the teller understanding why they matter, that Joel Sawyer had worn paper in his boots that whole winter, from November to nearly March, because his soles had gone, and he hadn't had money for new boots after he gave away his coat to help out some woman who was new in town. Curtis had laughed about it, fondly, the way you laugh about an old foolish brave thing a friend did that turned out all right, and Pearl had laughed with him and let the conversation move on, because that was the appropriate response in that context. But she had carried it with her after, paper in his boots. Through November and December and January and February, 4 months of West Texas winter, with paper in his boots because he had given his coat to a woman he'd spoken to for 10 minutes on a boardwalk, because she was short 32 cents for her first month's rent, and he had seen it and could not walk away from the seeing. She was standing in the cottonwood shade with this in her mind when Joel came to find her, the way he always found her in social gatherings, with a glass of water for her and the easy, unhurried approach of a man who has been navigating towards someone specific. "You've gone quiet," he said, handing her the glass, which was both an observation and an inquiry. "I was thinking about something," she said. "Something good or something that needs dealing with. Something from a long time ago," she said. She looked at him, at his face that she knew as well as her own now, the lines that the sun had put at the corners of his eyes and the gray that had come into his hair at the temples over the past year, the expression that meant he was listening. "Do you remember the day we met? November of '79, he said. "You were counting coins on the boardwalk." She was slightly surprised. "You remember that specifically?" "I remember most things about that day," he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had, low and direct, the voice of someone who means exactly what he is saying. "I remember you had a blue bonnet and a carpetbag and an expression that you were working very hard to keep neutral." "I was," she said. "I was short 32 cents. I know. You gave me your coat." "I did." She looked at him. "I found out recently," she said carefully, "about your boots." There was a small pause. He looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately read, somewhere between amusement and something more tender. "What about my boots?" "That you wore paper in them all winter," she said. "Because you sold the coat and couldn't afford new ones because you had already spent what you had." He was quiet for a moment. "Curtis told you," he said, not a question. "Curtis told me," she confirmed. He thought it was a funny story. And it was, the way he told it, you and your paper boots riding out in the January cold. She paused. "But it wasn't nothing. It cost you something real." He looked at her for a long moment, and the evening light was coming through the cottonwood leaves in the way it does in late September, warm and particulate, making everything look like it is lit from inside. "Pearl," he said, "I was cold for a few months. That's all it was." "That's not all it was," she said. "You didn't know me. You saw a woman on a boardwalk who was short 32 cents and you gave her your winter coat, knowing you couldn't replace it that month, knowing what Texas winters cost, and you did it without making her feel like she was receiving charity, which is its own kind of skill, and then you walked away and were cold for 4 months and didn't say a word about it." She stopped. "Do you understand how I've thought about that, over the years, what it meant?" He was quiet, and she could see something moving in his expression, not discomfort exactly, but the particular careful attention of a person who is receiving something they've been given and taking it seriously. "I knew your situation," he said quietly. "I'd been in something similar. Not exactly the same, but enough to understand what it feels like to be standing in a street with not enough in your pocket and too much pride to show it. And I could fix it, right then, with something I could spare." He paused. "It wasn't noble, it was just practical." "You called it practical," she said. "You always do that. You put your wool coat between yourself and winter and call it practical." His mouth curved, that small and contained smile that she had first seen at the church social and which still, after 7 years, had the quality of a gift. "What would you call it?" She thought for a moment because she wanted to be precise. "The beginning," she said. "That's what I would call it. That is where we began, not at the social, not on the creek walk, not when you asked me to marry you. We began on that boardwalk when you saw something that needed doing and you did it without needing anything back from it. That's what I chose when I chose you. That's what I've been living in for 7 years." He looked at her, and the evening party went on behind them. the children's voices and the lamplight, and the sound of laughter from the table. And the cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze. And Joel Sawyer reached out and took her face in both his hands in that specific and deliberate way that was different from every other kind of touching. The way that says, I am not in a hurry and I see you completely. Pearl Langston, he said, which was what he called her sometimes when he wanted to say her full name, the name she had before she was his, as though to honor that she had been a whole person before him and was a whole person with him and would be a whole person after him if it came to that, and she loved him for knowing that distinction. You're calling me Pearl Langston, she said, because I want you to hear it as yourself, the person who got on a mail wagon with $4 and a carpet bag, and the person who stood on my homestead and said yes, and the person who has built this with me. He looked at her with something so open in his face that she felt the weight of it. I knew when I gave you that coat, not that we would marry, not specifically, but I knew that I didn't want to walk away without knowing what happened next for you. That's why I was at the store 3 weeks later. That's why I told you about the social. He paused. It wasn't entirely practical. She laughed, which was the right response to that, and she put her hands over his hands on her face and held them there, and they stood under the cottonwoods in the September evening with the whole of their life visible in both directions from that moment, and it was full and warm and complete. I want to tell Thomas about it someday, she said, when he's older, about where we came from. The paper boot story. The whole story, she said, the boardwalk and the coin purse and the coat, all of it. You could tell him now, Joel said. He's 8. He'd think the paper boots were funny. He would, Pearl agreed. And then he'd be furious that you didn't buy better boots. He'd be right, Joel said, and his smile was wider now, the full version that she had taken years to bring completely out of him, and which she considered one of the genuine accomplishments of her life. They went back to the party, and the evening continued, and the cake was eaten, and the lamp burned low, and the children fell asleep in the grass and had to be carried inside one by one. And the guests drove their wagons back toward town in the dark. And Pearl and Joel sat on the porch for a while after everyone had gone, in the particular piece of people who have said what needed saying and find themselves now on the other side of it, in open country. The years that followed were the years of building toward permanence, the years when the homestead became unmistakably theirs, not just in the legal sense of the title, but in the lived sense of a place that has been fully inhabited. The garden had fruit trees now, peach and apple, planted in 1884 and finally producing at their proper yield. The cattle herd had reached 120 head, and Joel had hired on 2 hands to help manage the range work. Pearl had taken on 2 apprentice seamstresses from among the local girls, young women in their late teens who came out to the Sawyer place 2 days a week and were learning a trade, and she taught them with the same practical directness that had been the method of her own education, not patient exactly but thorough, not gentle but fair. Thomas at 12 was doing a full man's work on the property after school and on weekends, serious and capable in a way that occasionally made Joel look at him with a slight wonder, the particular wonder of a parent who is watching a child develop into a person who has exceeded the sum of their origins. Clara at 9 was reading everything she could find and had declared her intention to be a schoolteacher, which was one of the few professional options available to women of her time and class, and Pearl was doing everything in her power to ensure she could pursue it, including a correspondence with a women's seminary in Dallas about the possibility of advanced schooling. William at 5 was still red-haired and extroverted, and kept every animal on the property engaged in his complicated social life, including a barn cat named Senator who had become, against his evident preferences, William's primary confidant. Pearl found that she was expecting again in the summer of 1889, which surprised her and did not entirely surprise her, and which made Joel laugh with a joy that was entirely undignified and which she found charming. For, she said, with a particular dry tone that conveyed both genuine pleasure and a slight exasperation with the reality of the situation. "We have the room," he said. "We will need to add to the house again," she said. "I'll start on it next spring," he said. He started on it that fall. The new baby arrived in January of 1890, a girl they named Ruth, small and loud and apparently intent on making her presence in the household as immediately significant as possible, which succeeded without difficulty. She arrived into a family that was already large enough to absorb a new member with celebration rather than adjustment, and the older children greeted her with a mixture of tenderness and competitive generosity that Pearl found both amusing and moving. She was sitting with Ruth one evening in February, the baby 3 weeks old and finally beginning to spend some portion of each day in a state other than furious demand. And Joel came in from the cold with snow on his hat brim and stood in the lamplight looking at the two of them with an expression that Pearl had learned by now was not something she needed to name or analyze. It was simply the expression of a man who is where he wants to be and knows it. "There was a letter," he said, taking it from his coat pocket, "from the land office in Austin. The additional claim. She had been expecting correspondence about an additional 10 acres they'd applied for along the north fence." "Approved," he said, and sat down across from her, and she watched him open the letter and read it with that focused, unhurried attention he brought to official matters, moving his lips slightly as he worked through the legal language, and she thought, not for the first time, that she could watch him for the rest of her life and not run out of things to see. "We own the land to the north fence," he said, looking up. "Good," she said. 160 additional acres, he said. "Good," she said again, and she meant it entirely. The particular solid satisfaction of a thing that was worked toward and achieved, stone by stone, season by season. He put the letter down and looked at her and the baby, and then he said, with the matter-of-fact directness that was his particular mode of the most important statements, "I want you to know that every good thing in my life since November of '79 has had you at the center of it." She looked at him over Ruth's small dark head. "That's a very generous accounting," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. "I was a working hand on somebody else's land with a pair of boots that let in the cold. Now I have 160 acres plus what we already had, and 4 children and a wife who can do anything, and I am never cold." He paused. "I want you to know that I know the difference between those two states, and that the difference is you." Pearl Langston, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with $4.32 and a carpetbag and a father's Bible and nothing else, looked at her husband in the lamplight of the house they had built together, with their 4th child in her arms and 3 others asleep in the rooms he had added to contain them, on land they had filed for together and proven up with their own work, and felt the full weight of everything that word contained. The distance from that boardwalk in November to this lamplight in February, the coat and the coin purse and the church social and the creek walk and the June morning on the homestead land when she had said yes to a man she had known for 7 months and understood was the right answer for the rest of her life. "I know the difference too," she said. "I have known it since the day you stood on a boardwalk in the cold in your flannel shirt and refused to let me call it anything except a loan." He smiled at that. "You paid it back," he said, "the very first month." "I did," she said. "In the form of a pair of boot soles," he said, his smile wider now, "which were, if I recall, very precisely measured and rather neatly installed." She had, in fact, repaired his boots for him the first month she worked at the Caldwell store, having discovered the state of them when he came in for something in December, and she had noticed the worn sole from her position behind the lower counter. She had done it quietly, without announcement, cut new leather soles from a piece he hadn't asked her to use, and installed them while he was talking to Mrs. Caldwell about something else, and when she handed his boots back to him across the counter he had looked at them for a moment and then at her, and she had looked back at him with the same matter-of-fact expression he had used on the boardwalk, because she had correctly understood that this was the appropriate response and that the symmetry of it would not be lost on him. It had not been lost on him. "We were even after the boots," she said now. "We were even after the boots," he agreed. They sat together in the lamplight, and Ruth slept in Pearl's arms with the absolute commitment to sleep that very young babies have, and the fire in the stove made its small sound, and outside the February wind moved across the land that was theirs, all of it, to the north fence and beyond. And Pearl thought about the word even, about what it meant between two people who had always been careful to maintain the balance, to make sure that what passed between them was exchange rather than debt. And she thought that even was actually not quite right, because what they had was not a balance sheet but something else, something that didn't subtract or add but simply grew, the way good land does, when it is properly tended. She told Thomas the story that spring, when he was old enough to understand the significance of it. He was 13 by then, and she told it to him on a Saturday afternoon when they were working the garden together, planting the season's bean rows, and she told it the way good stories should be told, with all the details in their right places, the coin purse and the cold and the coat and the man who would not let her call it charity, and Thomas listened with the still attention that was so much like his father's, and at the end of it he was quiet for a moment. "So he gave away his winter coat for 32 cents, Thomas said. "For the principle of the 32 cents, Pearl said, the coat was worth considerably more, and wore paper in his boots all winter. All winter, Thomas thought about this, and you didn't know about the boots until much later. Not until last year, she said. Curtis told me. He was quiet for another moment, working the garden row. Does he know you know? He asked. He does now, she said. Thomas looked up at her with that direct look that was hers exactly, the same pale gray-green eyes, the same quality of seeing. What did he say when you told him? He said it was practical, Pearl said. Thomas considered this. That sounds right, he said. It does, she agreed. They finished the row together in the warm spring light, and Pearl thought about the fact that this story was now being passed forward, entering the second generation, becoming part of the particular history that families build in the gaps between the official record, the true account of who people were to each other when it mattered. The following years brought the particular texture of an established life, things that were not dramatic but were deeply real, the rhythms of seasons and work and the children growing and the cattle and the land. Thomas at 16 was doing the work of a full ranch hand, and had begun to talk about his own eventual land claim with a seriousness that Joel met with equal seriousness and considerable pride. Clara was accepted to the Dallas Seminary in 1894, which was the event of the year on the Sawyer homestead, and Pearl spent 3 days in a state of emotion that she managed to express mostly through a very elaborate celebratory supper, because that was the medium she had available, and it was sufficient to the occasion. William at 9 was still red-haired and still in possession of an extroverted energy that found its most effective outlet in the management of the cattle, which he did with a natural ease that suggested he had been born knowing where cattle wanted to go and how to make them go there. Ruth at 4 was already her mother's daughter in ways that were sometimes comic in their precision, the same set of the jaw, the same directness of gaze, the same quality of deciding something, and then acting on it without visible deliberation. Pearl was 40 years old in 1897, which was the year that Dusty Creek got its own telegraph office, and a second dry goods store, and a 2-room schoolhouse that replaced the old single-room building where all 4 of her children had started their education. The town had grown in the 18 years since she had arrived on the mail wagon, had acquired the particular character of a place that has made its decision to persist, not a boomtown but a genuine community, rooted in the specific geography and economy of its location. She walked down Main Street one October afternoon that year, running an errand that took her past the spot where she had stood in November of 1879 counting coins in her palm, and she stopped there for a moment without particularly planning to. The boardwalk was newer than it had been, replaced twice in the intervening years, and the land office had been expanded, and there was a new building where there had been a gap between the feed store and the telegraph office. But the proportions of the street were the same, and the sky above it was the same High Plains October sky, that deep particular blue, and the wind was cold in the way that November was coming. She stood there for a moment and let herself be in both times at once, that first afternoon and this one, and she thought about what she would have thought if someone had told her then. The woman with the coin purse and the carpet bag and the careful neutral expression, that she would stand in this same spot 18 years later with a husband and 4 children and 160+ acres of proven homestead land, and the specific unassailable security of being known and loved by another person. She thought she would not have believed it. Not because she had lacked ambition, but because she had arrived so empty of everything except the will to keep going, and the distance between nothing and this was so large that it was difficult to comprehend even standing at the far end of it looking back. A step beside her. Joel, because of course it was Joel, who had apparently had the same errand direction, and had spotted her standing still in the middle of the boardwalk, with the expression he associated with her serious thinking. Remembering something. He said, counting something, she said, measuring the distance. He looked at the stretch of street in front of them, understanding immediately, because after 18 years he read her geography the way he read the land's topography, by long familiarity and attentive observation. Long way from November 79, he said. Very long, she said. He stood beside her for a moment in the October cold, his shoulder against hers, and they both looked at the street that had been the beginning of everything. And then he took her hand the way he had taken it on the creek walk in February of 1880, with that specific and intentional quality, and they walked together down the street toward the dry goods store, where Pearl needed thread and Joel was ostensibly returning an implement to the blacksmith, but had actually come to see if his wife needed any help with the parcels. She did not, as it happened, need any help with the parcels. She let him carry them anyway. The last week of November 1897 brought an early cold snap that coated the creek willows with ice and sent the cattle to the south pasture, where the limestone bluffs cut the worst of the wind, and Pearl baked enough bread to see the family through 3 days of staying close to the stove, which was the practical response to weather that was not dangerous but not worth contending with unnecessarily. The children were all in their proper places. Thomas in the far pasture with the cattle, Clara at school in Dallas writing letters that arrived every 2 weeks with her characteristic density of information, William doing his figures at the kitchen table with his boots propped on the chair rung and his tongue between his teeth, and Ruth asleep in the small room off the kitchen with a fever that was the ordinary variety, the kind that required tending but not alarm. Joel was in the barn when Pearl looked out the window at the late afternoon sky, which had the flat pewter color that means more weather coming, and thought about November 1879, as she did every November, not with sadness or nostalgia exactly, but with the particular quality of gratitude that comes from knowing the specific moment when your life changed direction and being clear-eyed about what caused it. She had thought about that coat so many times, the wool weight of it in her hands, the way he had held it out at that slight forward angle. The fact that he had gone home and put paper in his boots and said nothing about it to anyone had simply been cold because he had decided it was the right thing to do and then did it and did not make a story out of the doing. She went to the door of the kitchen and called across the yard to the barn, her voice carrying in the cold, clear air, "Joel, come in before the weather turns." A pause and then his voice back. 5 minutes. "Now," she said, which was a word she used infrequently enough that it had weight when she used it. He came in 4 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots on the threshold, and she handed him a cup of coffee before he had taken his hat off, and he looked at her over it with that expression that meant he was reading something in her face. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted you inside." He held her gaze for a moment, and she knew he knew it was more than that, and she knew he wasn't going to push on it because that was not his manner, and she knew that later, when the children were in bed and the stove had settled to its night rhythm, she would tell him what she had been thinking, which was this: that she had spent 18 years being grateful for the coat, and that somewhere in the past year she had moved past gratitude into something that felt more like peace, the settled, permanent peace of someone who has understood how they got where they are, and has found the story of the getting entirely worthy of the destination. She had arrived in Dusty Creek with nothing and found everything, and the hinge of it, the single turning point on which all the rest had swung, was a man she hadn't known yet, standing on a boardwalk in November, who had seen her and could not walk away from the seeing. William looked up from his figures. "Mama, is it going to snow tonight?" "Probably," Pearl said. "Good," he said, with the satisfaction of a 9-year-old for whom snow meant a legitimate excuse to abandon arithmetic. Joel sat down at the table across from his son and looked at the figures. "This column's wrong," he said, pointing. "Carry the remainder." William made a face. "Papa, it's nearly supper." "Arithmetic doesn't stop for supper," Joel said, and slid the paper back to him. Pearl put the bread on the table and called through the door for Thomas, who came in from the cold with the smell of the outdoors on him and his father's quality of quietness and his father's eyes, dark brown and careful, and sat down without being told to and reached for the bread with the automatic ease of a young man who is always hungry. "The south herd is settled," he told Joel. "The Carmody fence is holding." "Good," Joel said. "There's a section of the east wall in the barn that needs looking at," Thomas added. "The wind's getting through." "I'll look at it tomorrow," Joel said. They ate supper together in the lamplight, the 5 of them around the table, Ruth still sleeping her fever sleep in the small room, the snow beginning outside the window, the stove warm and the bread hot and the coffee on the back plate, and Pearl sat at her end of the table and looked at her family and thought, "Here. This is what it is. This is the whole of it." 20 years after she had stood on a boardwalk in the cold with not enough money in her coin purse, Pearl Sawyer knew the exact coordinates of her own life. She knew the longitude and latitude of it, the history and the future of it, the cost and the value of it in every currency that mattered. She knew it the way she knew the face of her husband across the table from her, completely and without reserve, every line and expression committed to a memory that would outlast every weather and every winter. And in the spring of 1899, when Ruth was 9 and old enough to understand a story told with all its proper weight, Pearl sat with her youngest daughter in the garden where the peach trees were blooming, and she told her the story of November 1879, the coin purse and the boardwalk and the coat and the man who wore paper in his boots, so that a woman he didn't know could afford her first month of rent. Ruth listened with her chin on her knees, her mother's gray-green eyes very serious in her small face. "He didn't even know you," Ruth said. "No," Pearl said, "he didn't. But he gave you his coat anyway." "He did, because it was the right thing to do." Pearl thought about this for a moment. "Because he saw me," she said. "Really saw me, and when you really see someone, you can't walk away without doing what you can." Ruth was quiet for a while, watching the peach blossoms move in the spring wind. "Is that how love starts?" she asked. Pearl looked at her daughter, at the gravity and the curiosity of her small face, and then she looked across the yard to where Joel was working the new fence line with Thomas, the two of them moving with the easy synchrony of father and son who have learned the same physical language, and she watched Joel straighten from his work and look toward the garden, toward her and Ruth in the peach tree shade, and lift his hand in the small wave that was their specific shorthand for everything that didn't need saying because it was already understood between them. She waved back. "Yes," she told her daughter, "that's exactly how it starts." The peach trees bloomed. The fence went up. The spring light moved across the Texas high plains with its ancient indifference to the human lives below it, and on the Sawyer homestead, 8 miles northeast of Dusty Creek, the life that had begun on a boardwalk in November continued its patient and extraordinary progress, rooted in land that was theirs, held by work they had done together, sustained by the particular love of two people who had found each other at the exact moment when both of them needed finding, and who had spent the intervening years honoring that original gift by building something from it that was worth the cost of a winter coat and a pair of paper-stuffed boots, and every cold mile between that first afternoon and this warm spring morning, this ordinary and irreplaceable life.